Okay, guys, delighted to be joined today by Cody Haun, who, despite me just checking the pronunciation there, may have butchered that, but no, I think I did a decent job. Cody started out as a personal trainer, wanted a little bit of a deeper understanding of the science behind training, so he's pursued further education, gained a PhD. I was going to say he's now a researcher, educator, and coach, which may be true, but just on a little bombshell. Before we start, he said he's transitioned away from full-time academia and doing some exciting new things. He's also got some alarms set.
Sorry about that.
No worries. So Cody, give us the lowdown. What are you currently doing? What's the new venture?
Yeah, well, I have transitioned out of full-time academia, so I'm still teaching some online, some graduate courses related to nutrition and training. But now I'm transitioning into my own research and training practice. I think we're going to talk a good bit about individual responses to training and inter-individual heterogeneity and the response to training and nutrition and things like that. And really, I'm so interested in it that I felt like I could make more progress in answering some of the questions that I have and frankly helping more people directly through these, you could say, N of one studies or case studies and case reports. Some of the people I'll be testing are going to be my own coaching clients. And I like the idea of the accountability that provides, right? It's a very data-based process where they come in and I test their body composition, and I could talk about some of the equipment that I'm using if you want, or I can kind of stop there.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I'd love to know what's involved.
Okay, well, yeah. So right now I have a lot of this is expensive.
Yeah, yes, that was going to be one of my follow-up questions: is how you're funding all this. But yeah, well, let's go all in on this. You can talk us through it all. It sounds fascinating.
Yeah, slowly but surely on the funding thing. But yeah, I've started out with an ultrasound unit, a portable metabolic analyzer from a company called Pinoe.
Mm-hmm.
So I use that to test resting metabolic rate and respiratory exchange ratio, which you can derive what percentage of the calories that are being expended is from the breakdown of carbohydrates or fats. So that can be insightful. And then you can use that portable metabolic analyzer during exercise, right? So I can test VO2 max and ventilatory threshold and things like that. And then just looking at calorie expenditure, right, during different movements. Right now, I'm right next to a CrossFit gym. So I have some folks that are interested in the calories expended from a certain style of training or a workout, right, a benchmark workout versus some of the others, or during certain skills. So yeah, I guess long story short, you can do a lot with that piece of equipment. I really like it. Of course, with the ultrasound, you can assess local tissue architecture to a point and muscle and fat thickness, which can be useful for tracking change over time. And you can also derive body composition from that. So a colleague of mine, Grant Tinsley, Dr. Tinsley from Texas Tech, just published a paper showing that if you use BIA to measure body water and ultrasound to measure fat thickness at 7 sites, you can construct a 3-compartment model of body composition that seems to agree pretty well with a DEXA and a BOD-POD based lab derived 3-compartment model for body comp. So I'm using those techniques because I have a BIA device as well. I'm using that to construct a 3-compartment model for my clients. And then I do some basic stuff. I mean, obviously weight, using a good scale, and I have a stadiometer to measure height, measure vitals, blood pressure, pulse oximetry readings, resting heart rate. I have a good digital circumference tape that I use to measure circumferences. And then the idea, man, is over time I want to continue to build out my kit, so to speak, and my technique capabilities. So I'm looking at some other equipment to create more of an applied exercise physiology lab, you could say, early on. And then eventually I would love to have a place where I can even process, biological samples and do some wet lab work. So saliva testing and blood testing and maybe even some muscle biopsies.
You've got to just persuade some people to let you biopsy them first, though.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, man, that's the current state of things. So it's a work in progress. But I finally have a good space ready to go and have those techniques. So I'm looking forward to this new journey. But I mean, man, we'll talk about some of the research, I suppose, that inspired this. But I'm really interested in how to individualize training and nutrition and supplementation for people. And
yes.
How do we use the scientific process to fine tune someone's approach to their diet and their training. And so this is going to be my attempt at doing that, I guess.
Absolutely right. And that sounds absolutely incredible. A great setup. And just so, do you have you said you got the CrossFit place next door, but within your setting, have you got the ability for people like a gym setting as well, so they can train there too, or is it just more that at this as things stands, it's the lab side of things you have?
Right now, it's mostly testing. Like for example, I'm going to purchase some force plates eventually, and like a velocity measurement device, and be able to do some basic kinetic and kinematic measurements during certain exercises and load velocity profiling and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, the gym is right next door. So eventually this is a multi-phase process. I see the main focus of the practice, you could say, is going to be research and testing. Part of it is coaching. Most of that occurs via consulting, and it's mostly remote. But yeah, I do enjoy to coach in person. It's just I'm trying to make the best use of my time. And I think that right now that's mostly research and testing with a little bit of in-person coaching. So I intend to have blocks of time each week that I'll work with some clients in person, but I want to focus most of my effort to research and testing and collecting data and monitoring their progress, with them quantifying what they're doing for their training. A lot of my clients right now are online. They're dispersed throughout the world. So I use a couple softwares to help aggregate data from training and their nutrition. And the vision is you have a very comprehensive picture of what someone's doing with their training and their nutrition. And especially for the in-person clients, I'm monitoring how well that's working, and what we can do about it if it's not.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, obviously, as you say, you've got clients spread all over the place, but anyone who's local to you is basically signing up to be a lab rat and have all these tests. A bit of a guinea pig. You get them in, and they can have all these things tested. Well, I mean, it just sounds like a fantastic setup and a very exciting one. And I think actually for people, so like, I'm more on the coaching side of things, but you're doing that research, and then the impact you can have is that knowledge and the research and that comes from that spreads out, and then more and more practitioners all over the world can then put into to practice the principles and things from what you're unearthing with your research. So it sounds brilliant to me.
Yeah, man, that's the idea. I mean, I intend to publish these, I'll call them case studies or case reports, eventually in open access journals if they actually pass peer review. If they don't, I plan to share them freely in some way to help people. And I don't want there to be a paywall to access that information. So yeah, the idea is with that research arm of the practice is to put out information that hopefully will help other people fine-tune their own training and nutrition.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, let's talking about that fine-tuning things and the different responses people have to training. If we transition into one of the key topics I want to talk to you on today is the concept of a non-responder and what differentiates a non-responder from a higher responder. So to kick things off, well, perhaps you could give us a definition of what's considered a non-responder.
Well, it of course depends on the response that we're talking about.
If we, just to interrupt, sorry, from a purely selfish standpoint, my online clients, mostly skinny guys struggling to build muscle. So if we view everything through the lens of hypertrophy, first of all, and then... Most important, yeah, absolutely. No doubt about that. So yeah, everything through that lens, and then obviously if we need to be more specific in certain avenues as we go down, then absolutely. But if we kick things off from that viewpoint.
Yeah, well, I think if we were to call someone a non-responder, then we're saying that they're not growing muscle in response to training. But as you know, training can look a million different ways. And so in the literature, often we'll use biopsies to measure the cross-sectional area of muscle fibers using a microscope and staining techniques, and we'll size the fibers before the training intervention and after. And so a non-responder or a low responder would be someone in which we did not observe an increase in fiber cross-sectional area. But that's not the only technique that's used to actually measure the construct of hypertrophy. So last year, my PhD, I wrote a review article with a stellar cast of authors that critically evaluated the construct of muscle hypertrophy and discussed how, if you conclude hypertrophy occurred, really depends upon the measurement that you use. So in the example of fiber cross-sectional area with another technique like ultrasound muscle thickness or a DEXA scan, right? You could see someone not increase their fiber cross-sectional area, but see an increase in ultrasound-derived muscle thickness or DEXA-derived lean soft tissue mass or lean body mass, as it's often referred to. So, yeah, the first step really is how are we determining response, right? What are we calling hypertrophy? And it's really a construct, right? And I think practically, right, to stop with the hand waving, we appreciate that we're talking about someone growing skeletal muscle tissue, right? And are there people who have more difficulty gaining skeletal muscle tissue in response to training?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that I answered your question, maybe the first one of how we define a non-responder or a low responder. So it would be someone who responds very little to a training intervention.
Yes, so in like the typical terminology, someone who considers themselves a hard gainer, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a fair term.
And then so quickly, you were talking about how you measure hypertrophy and the problems that presents and the different measures. So just as an aside, when we're analysing the literature to date, does that mean it's possible that there's to some extent maybe lots of what would we call it, false negatives potentially, or false positives, or whatever someone who's classified as a non-responder, maybe because of the method used, it's not necessarily that they are a non-responder. Is that a fair comment? Or
I mean, you look at the resistance training literature that has focused on assessing changes in skeletal muscle mass, and inevitably you see a variety of these techniques that are used to assess it. I mean, some studies will use DEXA, some will use ultrasound, some will use biopsies, some will use circumference measurements, some will use skin folds, some will use BIA. I mean, there's and BOD-POD, that's another one, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the reality is that those measurements don't perfectly correlate in every study, even like when you combine these measurements in the same study and you expect them to agree, right? If if you see an increase in fiber cross-sectional area, we would reasonably anticipate to see an increase in ultrasound-derived muscle thickness. We would reasonably expect to see an increase in DEXA-derived lean body mass in that segment, let's just say the thigh region, which is where we'll often take biopsies. But in our research and in others' research, they don't perfectly correlate. And in fact, sometimes the correlations are poor.
Right.
And there are some reasons for that, and we talk about that in the review article for anyone interested in some of the nitty-gritty details. But it is important to consider that classifying someone as a low or a non-responder depends in large part on how you're actually taking the measurement and what you're calling hypertrophy. You know? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's important to understand. But I suppose from if we take this into someone, how you're going to apply it to the real world, it is fairly obvious. There are people that grow quicker than others, respond better than training, and there's those guys that, despite doing what appears to be everything correctly, struggle to put on size. So being a hard gainer, a non-responder, or just a lower responder is obviously a thing. In the real world, it seems. So based on what the research is telling us, what you've looked at, what factors can go into contributing? Because it's not going to be just one factor from my understanding of it. It's going to a combination of multiple factors that could determine if someone is a non-responder or towards that end of the spectrum.
Yeah, that's the question, right? And if we can figure that out, what do we do about it, right?
Exactly.
And that's one reason I'm doing what I'm doing now. I think it's a very interesting area. If we have a person who believes that they are a hard gainer or has evidence to show that they have had difficulty gaining muscle, we'll stick with the hypertrophy topic. What do we do about it? And are there people who, despite a nearly perfect training program and reasonable nutrition approach, that will just never gain the amount of muscle that they would hope for or compared to someone else of similar anthropometrics or in a similar demographic? And so I think that there are people who, from a physiological perspective, will get pushback from their physiology, at least initially. And we have to also separate, I think, someone who's untrained and what physiological profile they have before they start training versus someone who's been training for a while and what their physiology looks like before they start training. But just kind of looking at some of the physiological differences between low and high responders in aggregate. We wrote a review article that's published in Frontiers in Physiology that my mentor, Dr. Mike Roberts, was the first author on that, and it explored a lot of different physiological factors that can influence someone's response to training, whether they be trained or untrained. But in aggregate, I think I can give some of the variables that I'm reasonably confident that play an important role in modulating someone's responsiveness to training. I think the first one is, well, let me back up for a second. If we think of hypertrophy in response to training involving three primary factors, and this is kind of how we open that review article: muscle protein synthesis, so factors that influence muscle protein synthesis, muscle protein breakdown and factors that influence muscle protein breakdown, and then satellite cell mediated myonuclear addition. So the donation of nuclei from these satellite cells that are sort of like muscle stem cells. What factors affect MPS, MPB, so muscle protein synthesis, muscle protein breakdown, and satellite cell activity? Because those are, the three, I think, key physiological phenomena that modulate the hypertrophic process, you could say. So I think the first one is related to muscle protein synthesis, and it's related to ribosomes. And so ribosomes are these organelles in muscle cells that translate messenger RNA molecules. So the message from a gene that's in a molecular form, this mRNA molecule that codes for muscle protein. Ribosomes translate those messenger RNA molecules into proteins. So when we think about muscle protein synthesis is really the process of synthesizing protein from messenger RNA, and ribosomes are the organelles that actually perform that. So there does appear to be a difference in multiple studies between how many ribosomes are present in a muscle at baseline and to what extent an individual increases their ribosome content. That's called ribosome biogenesis. And so the idea is that if someone is better at increasing their ribosome content, they have a greater translational capacity, right? Compared to someone who does not create as many ribosomes in response to training. Perhaps they do not have as high of a translational capacity, and that can affect the magnitude of increase in muscle protein synthesis in response to resistance training or even to feeding, right, to the ingestion of protein. If you have a relatively low amount of ribosomes in your muscles versus a relatively high amount of ribosomes, that could theoretically affect that MPS response to an anabolic stimulus.
Mm-hmm.
So any questions about that one, or that makes sense?
It makes sense. Yeah, I think makes sense to me. Yeah, I think probably if we continue down the other factors, then maybe we'll try and pull this back together and see if what the practical takeaways are.
Yeah, okay. So I think that the next one is related to satellite cells.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's pretty good data out of Dr. Marcus Baumann's lab, that early on, I mean, and shout out to Dr. Marcus Baumann. He was one of the first researchers in this area when it comes to investigating the inter-individual responses to training and, quote unquote, low versus high responders in the early 2000s. In the 2000s particularly, they published some work that suggested that the number of satellite cells that a person had before a training intervention seemed to predict how well they grew muscle in response to the training intervention.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that makes sense to me. I mean, there are other studies that have not shown a relationship, but in principle, if you add myonuclei to a muscle cell, in your myonuclei, in your nucleus, that's where your DNA is, right? And that's where the genetic information is that encodes the information to create protein, right? And so theoretically, and this is called the myonuclear domain, if you have more myonuclei, you can oversee a greater volume of cellular space because you can churn out the messenger RNA, and then those messenger RNA can be translated into proteins. So theoretically, it increases the capacity really to manage cellular space if you have more myonuclei. So it makes sense to me that someone that's a high responder would have more of these satellite cells, these muscle stem cells that can donate their nucleus. And interestingly, they seem to be responsive to muscle damage. There was a recent study that, and that's, we can get into that and the mechanisms of hypertrophy, but it's debated as to whether muscle damage is necessary or really additive to the hypertrophic response to training. And this recent study suggests, they called them, I think, damage-derived molecular signals that seem to activate or increase the activity of satellite cells. And so it makes sense to me that someone's responsiveness to resistance training in part is influenced by their ability to increase their myonuclear number through the activity of these satellite cells. So differences in satellite cell amounts can be another factor. And then there are some others that have, I think, less evidence but make sense that we have found in our own research. Part of this was during my PhD at Auburn University, again in Dr. Mike Roberts' lab. We did multiple training studies while I was there and did some of this research to better understand what's happening at the molecular level that helps to explain some of the variation that we see in the hypertrophic response. And so another one is potentially mitochondrial volume.
Okay.
So the amount, or you could say mitochondrial density, but conceptually really the amount of mitochondria in a muscle cell may influence someone's responsiveness to training. Mitochondria are important for the creation of ATP, and the synthesis of myofibrillar protein is a very energy demanding process. And it makes sense that if you have more mitochondria, at least to a point, right, that you have a greater capacity to supply the energy for increasing muscle protein synthesis. And we found in one study, this is from untrained individuals, from my friend Dr. Brooks Mobley, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Kentucky. For his PhD dissertation, we did a training study using untrained subjects and found that with a follow-up analysis that individuals who seemed to grow more muscle, they tended to have more mitochondria in their muscle cells before the study started.
Right, okay.
So that's one. Do you want me to stop there or keep going?
No, well, actually, let's just stop there for a second. So a couple of times we've talked about things that at the beginning of the study indicates what they might be. And actually, just getting back to it, my understanding is that some research indicates like heritability accounts for roughly 50% of the adaptations to a training stimulus. Now, I don't know how accurate, how useful that is, but it seems to me we're going to try and talk about maybe the things you can do to improve your training, but to some extent, you have to. That would indicate there's a reasonable amount which is perhaps predetermined about how good your results are going to be, no matter how finely tuned your training and nutrition is. Now, you kind of scratched your head and frowned and things when I mentioned that study. So perhaps maybe just give me your thoughts on that. That's or that information, and that, because I've seen that, like, obviously I think it was in a paper that was peer reviewed and published, but I've seen it churned out in plenty of articles online now, and there's two ways of looking at it, I suppose. One's the glass is empty, 50% is taken care of, whether, if we're taking this at face value, that is. The other thing is that actually 50% is still a huge amount that you can have an influence over.
Yeah, well, it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly, man, when we start talking about genetics and the role that genetics play in modulating the response to resistance training, especially when it comes to hypertrophy. There's just so many different genes that are involved. And yeah, so if you look at Claude Bouchard, his early research, it was the Heritage Family Study that looked at responsiveness for VO2 max and drew some inferences in explaining some of the variation in the VO2 max improvement that they saw. And yeah, I mean, you had people who didn't improve, barely improved at all, and then people who improved significantly, right? And it's this nice waterfall chart. And they say that around 50% of the variation in the VO2 max response was explained by genetics. And I want to say it was about 20 single nucleotide polymorphisms. So those are, one letter differences in the genetic sequence for certain genes that code for certain enzymes or proteins that can affect the function of that enzyme or protein. So that's for VO2 max. We do not really know that for hypertrophy. We don't know that when it comes to growing muscle. Now, I will say, if you look at some of the heritability research, that's a safe number most of the time, is around 50% of someone's performance or fitness or improvement in fitness or some kind of fitness characteristic seems to be explained by genetic variation. But a lot of the research on genes related to someone's responsiveness in terms of hypertrophy has investigated single nucleotide polymorphisms or single gene candidates. And I'm not an expert on genetics, but I do know enough to appreciate that things like what are called insertion deletion alleles and tandem repeats and epigenetics is a whole nother thing that it gets really complicated really quickly. But that's a whole nother potential factor that influences someone's responsiveness to training, and that is factors that can affect the transcription of genes and the activity of certain genes. In other words, you may have a gene. Possession does not necessarily equal expression, though, right? And epigenetic factors can affect if a gene is being expressed or not. And your environment, your food, your training can affect that general category of epigenetics and influence your expression of genes. So, yeah, I mean, earlier this year, a friend of mine, Dr. Chris Van, he is a postdoc researcher at Duke now. He published a study in collaboration with Dr. Roberts and Dr. Stuart Phillips from McMaster University in Canada and some other colleagues there at Auburn. And they took a look at several single nucleotide polymorphisms that may explain the hypertrophic response to resistance training using subjects from multiple studies. And none of the single nucleotide polymorphisms explained a significant amount of variation in the hypertrophic response. What did seem to explain some of the variation, at least one of the best predictors in that study, and this also agrees with some of my research for my PhD, was the size of fibers at baseline and the amount of lean soft tissue mass that subjects possessed at baseline. With the larger fibers and the larger amount of soft tissue mass, the less subjects seem to grow in response to training. And I found something similar with my dissertation project when I looked at different variables that could explain some of the variation that I saw in my subjects for my dissertation, and I found that two of the best predictors seem to be the size of muscle fibers at baseline, with the individuals that started with larger fibers seem to grow less. And then the other one that was interesting, I was going to get to this one down the line, is the number of type 2 fibers that they had in their biopsy sample. So it seemed that the subjects who had more type 2 fibers grew more muscle than subjects that had less type 2 fibers in their quadricep, their vastus lateralis muscle.
Okay, interesting. So actually, that led me, I was thinking, you've mentioned ribosomal biogenesis, satellite cells, and then I was thinking there's a few other factors that if I was thinking what might influence it, and then having read your paper, one that's obvious, like first one, people will be thinking, well, guys that take steroids grow bigger, so my androgen production on things like testosterone, how much of an influence does that play? So I don't know if there is any research on within normal physiological ranges if that has an influence. The other one, obviously, muscle fiber type would be one that I'm sure people would be thinking would be a big factor. So obviously you've just referenced that, and I suppose the other one is, I think, almost like joint structure and then connective tissue, like kind of almost thinking if the frameworks or the skeleton, is only so big, then naturally there's only so big that you're going to grow from that. And so is there some kind of research on basic anthropometrics and people's starting point with joint size or size of connective tissue? I don't know if they've been able to analyze that and how that influences things.
Yeah, well, Where would you like for me to start on that one?
All right. Well, we'll go with fiber type because you were talking about that, and then I'll try and remember to go back to the other two.
Yeah. So I mean, there's some research that hasn't reported a relationship between baseline, you could say fiber type phenotype, and the response to training. I would say that we're probably in the minority with that finding. So it's important to interpret that carefully because we do know that fiber types can change. And Dr. Andy Galpin is really an expert on that and is doing some amazing research looking at single fibers, so isolating single muscle fibers and examining the protein expression of that single fiber and the characteristics of that single fiber versus other fibers from the biopsy samples. And he's found some really interesting things that you do have pure type 2 fibers. So they express myosin heavy chain 2A or 2X proteins, the contractile protein myosin. And it's 2A and 2X, and it has a unique molecular weight that could be measured in the lab. And then you have fibers that are pure type 1 myosin heavy chain expressing fibers, but then you also have hybrid fibers that have both types of myosin heavy chain proteins. And it's interesting that area is kind of evolving. So yeah, I mean, it did appear in my research that individuals that had more of these type 2 fibers at baseline grew more muscle than subjects that didn't. But kind of to bridge this to practical application, right, there's really not a way to know for sure. And it's probably different for every muscle unless you get, it is different for, unique muscles have unique fiber type phenotypes, right? There's some overlap between several, but if you really wanted to know, you would have to get a biopsy as of now, like every muscle in your body. So that's not really practically helpful. And I'm not aware of any way to test your genetics to predict your global fiber type phenotype and then predict the hypertrophic response, unfortunately. Eventually, just again to kind of bridge this whole conversation to practical application, I would love to get to the point where it's like, look, we can do this baseline testing, right? We can do genotyping, we can test your microbiome, we can test your hormones, we can test whatever, and put that into a regression equation of some sort and predict your responsiveness to X style of training.
Sure.
But I mean, man, we're a ways off from that.
Okay, well, you've given us an insight into a question I was going to ask later on. Is there aren't any predictors people can be using? So we'll maybe circle back around to that. Interesting, you mentioned Andy Galpin there. He's been on the show before, and he was talking about. I'm not sure. I don't think it was his research, but referencing someone else's research, though, that these non-responders, it's to some extent there's maybe some evidence that you can shift yourself from a non-responder to a higher responder, whether you go to high responder, whatever. But almost this theory that people train, do everything right, and then there's not the huge gain in size short term that they're hoping for. But I don't know, call it a year, all of a sudden that to some way their physiology shifted a little bit, and they're starting to see a better response. So there's like a delayed response to training, perhaps. Are you aware of anything that's indicating that might be a possibility?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. So honestly, Tom, I'm pretty skeptical when someone says that they're a quote-unquote hard gainer or a non-responder. That is under the impression that they're doing everything right. It's been my experience that individuals that are under the impression that they are a hard gainer or they're having difficulty gaining muscle or strength, when you take a look at what they're doing, it's often, I think, suboptimal. Based on meta-analytical findings of what seems to work pretty well for training for muscle growth and what your nutrition should look like. So I think it's important before someone believes that they are a hard gainer or non-responder that you've really exploited everything that we know of that seems to work pretty well. And to kind of speak to that point a little bit more, you really have to quantify, in my view, the dose of training and your response to it carefully to fairly conclude that you are a hard gainer or a non-responder. And you really have to try out, I think, a variety of training approaches, doses, if you will, and measure objectively and in a standardized way your response to it before you conclude that you are a low responder or non-responder. So with that said, I read a recent study just as an example, and we could go down the rabbit hole on this. But, it's often thought that someone who is not responding well to training should do less. Perhaps they are inducing too much inflammation and muscle damage, and they should back off. Well, while there may be people like that, I've found, and I think some of the literature attests to this, that it seems that they might need to do more.
Yes.
They either need to train more frequently or with higher volumes. And I think, again, there's some literature to support that. I think one example recently that I read was last name of the first author starts with an S. I want to say it was, I'm going to butcher it. I'm not even going to try.
I butcher people's surnames every week, so you might as well join me in that.
I think it was Scarpinelli. I could be way off on that, man. But I can share.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, I can share the paper. I just read this recently, but they examined the training logs of participants before a study, and do you know the study I'm talking about?
Yeah, I don't like, so I can't critique your spelling of that, but I'm aware of the study. Yeah,
okay.
Your pronunciation. Sorry. So yes, yeah, I can't remember who flagged it up to me, but I've only seen the abstract. I can't say I've read the whole thing, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically they had a group that increased their training volume by about 20% relative to their recent historical training. And then they had another group that trained with a seemingly efficacious dose. I want to say it was around 20 sets per week for muscles of the leg. But you kind of get the difference, right? One group intentionally overloaded relative to their recent historical training, whereas the other group, I don't want to say ambiguously, but trained with a standardized program that wasn't relative to their recent historical training. And the study reported that the group that trained with 20% higher volume than recent historical training grew more muscle.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that's important. That's just one example of how, are we certain that you are a low or a non-responder when you haven't exploited, all of these different options that may make sense. And I know that's kind of difficult to digest, right? Because it's like, well, what do you mean? Like, would I literally have to do every single type of training program before I can conclude that? That's not what I'm saying. I think, we are pretty confident that the number of challenging sets, we can say, that you perform per week for a given muscle seems to be pretty related to the muscle growth response, where around 4 or 6 sets will get you some growth, but 10 sets or more up to some maximum point that largely depends on the person. More volume to a point seems to result in more growth, with some assumptions about the load being used and the difficulty of the set.
Mm-hmm.
So I think someone should track their set volume for a period of time, and have some kind of good standardized measurement of hypertrophy. And that can look a lot of different ways. I mean, for a lot of my remote clients, I really encourage them to take skin folds and circumference measurements and take biweekly photos and track their scale weight, right? I mean, those are really, it's difficult to make it more objective than that unless someone's willing to go in and find somewhere to do a DEXA scan or a bod pod test or some other more formal laboratory-based measurement of body comp. But I think that's a good starting point, right? You need to be quantifying the dose of training to a point, and you need to be quantifying your response to it before you are confident you're a non-responder.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's some great points there. And quickly, we talked about the heritability and how that came from endurance stuff. Even in the endurance literature, it's my understanding that there was people that considered non-responders when their volume increased, they became responders. Now, we can't necessarily just transplant that straight into hypertrophy world, but it would indicate that that's a possibility. And then
good point.
Kind of way I almost think about it with people is they may be a non-responder to this, but you're a not responder to this, but you might be a responder to that, like whether that be a different training modality or it's a simple thing which I suppose they're not necessarily knowing with research. People's technique, like people recording sets and reps and load, but they're just moving the bar through A to B with maybe terrible form. There's all of these factors. Like if you refine your technique, the intensity with which you train in terms of like relative intensity, how close to failure. I think there's a lot of guys who think themselves as non-responders, but they're leaving like 7 sets in reserve on every set. While the building muscle is hard and it requires a level of effort and consistency. And you're kind of talking about that with doing the boring stuff of measuring what quantifying the input you're giving your body and then the output that you get in terms of return on that, but actually doing putting the effort in the gyms, number one. And you've mentioned belief a couple of times. I also feel like some people it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They tag themselves as a hard gainer, and then sure enough that's what happens. So that's like a couple of tangents there that immediately came to mind. And the other one, of course, is that the reality, social media maybe warps people's perception, but for even someone who is considered a good responder, muscle growth, like large amounts of muscle, it takes time to build. Fat loss can be quite a quick process, but even for gifted people, muscle gain is going to take time, and therefore you're not going to see, within just a couple of weeks, huge increases in size, and it's very difficult to quantify. And as you said, use various objective measures to help with that. And I completely agree with that. So I think that's important just for people to get their head around that and manage expectations about you're not going to get jacked overnight, even if you are doing everything correct. And if you expect that, no wonder you classify yourself as a hard gainer, because you just have unrealistic expectations.
Really good points, man. Yeah, the belief one is probably worth pausing on for a second and talking a little bit about. I think It's something I really am adamant with clients when we do have conversations and more in-depth conversations about how things are going and tempering expectations, you could say. Your identity affects your behavior. Right. And if you consistently tell yourself that you are a non-responder and things aren't going well and etc., and it's negative, I don't think that's going to help. Mm-hmm. Right. I think that if you try to turn over every stone, so to speak, and try to optimize your environment and your diet and your training, and identify as someone who will respond well and believe that it's possible, that is likely to help, at least with behavior change, right? And I'm not saying that you can believe your way there. Of course, like you said, it takes effort, man, and hard training over broad time to maximize your muscle growth potential. And to speak to that point again, one observation is that I've found often, now there are exceptions, there's certainly those people out there that are training very hard, probably too much, and seeing a lack of a response. But often, man, it's a matter of just fine-tuning the training program, adjusting the frequency and getting total daily protein on point, and protein distribution, and supplementing well, and supplementing some around training, and using other supplements like creatine monohydrate, and making sure your sleep is on track, right? sleep is a superpower. I mean, I think we discount the power of regular deep restorative sleep. And it's like until you're covering all those bases and you're managing your stress really well, and you're doing all that, I would be very careful and caution anyone to think that they're a non-responder. And you coach people for a living, man, and so there's guys like us out there that are more than happy to help coach people along the way, and so they're not in the dark, so to speak, and
Yes.
can have some expert oversight.
Yeah. Well, I made a note as I kind of figured we get deep into the weeds of the science of this, that we need to bring it back to some of like the big rocks, so things that people day to day can actually influence. And I made a note like sleep, nutrition, smart programming. So you've referenced all of those there. And I think also talking about coaches, I think one of the best things perhaps people can do that consider themselves high gainer is get a coach, because then you almost need to be your own experiment. But if you don't have the underpinning knowledge of the principles, then you're just going to be throwing crap at a wall and hoping something sticks. And
Right.
and yeah, whereas if you have someone who kind of knows, all right, this is a good basic program and we can titrate certain variables and manipulate those from here to see how you respond and push things up, then we might find a way that's efficient for you. And then I suppose the only other one, or the other variable to that, and perhaps even more powerful, with that whole belief mindset, is go and find a group of guys who have had success at building muscle, and then just go and train with them for a while, because it'll probably be an eye-opening experience for, okay, this is what it takes, this is how hard, and sure, I bet, if you start doing that, you might find all of a sudden you may not be as big as them, but you'll start seeing some results.
Yeah, man, you're spot on, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, a good way to affect behavior change is to surround yourself with people who behave the way that you would like and have achieved things that you would like to achieve, right?
Yes.
That community piece is critical. So yeah, I think that's really wise advice.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad we agree on that. Now, I know we're sort of closing up on time. You're busy. Don't want to take up too much of your time. So I know I wanted to talk to you about resensitization phases. We're not going to have time for that. Maybe we'll get you on another episode to go through that, because I think that's another fascinating topic to cover there. So the metrics I just wanted to quickly talk about, to give some people some practical things to take about. You talked about like photos, scale weight, maybe tape measurements, maybe calipers. How important do you think gym performance is? So maybe if someone's tracking their 6, their 10 and their 12 rep maxes on some lifts, their relative strength, for example, for example, if they're using a bodyweight exercise at pull-ups, is there some in gym performance stats that they can also do that? Because we talked about this takes time, that there's giving them day to day that confidence that, okay, what I'm doing in the gym should be yielding result. I may not be able to measure that change in my physique yet, but if I keep stacking this up, it will get there.
Yeah, good question, man. Some things that I personally look at, I look at the average weight lifted, filtered by time for different exercises, and we're talking about hypertrophy primarily right now, and monitoring training variables to examine how well someone's responding. I think looking at the average weight lifted across a cycle and across multiple cycles is a very good proxy of growth, right? If you add 20 or 30% to the average weight lifted for bent over rows over the course of 3 months, I would say that you likely gained some contractile tissue in your back. And I would apply that logic to most things, man. And, it's debated if that's a good proxy measurement of growth. But I think in principle, physiologically speaking, if you're adding contractile tissue, if you're synthesizing and incorporating myofibrillar proteins and even some sarcoplasmic proteins, which we didn't really get into that, but that's maybe another podcast we can talk about.
Yes.
Sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and resensitization phases. But if you're incorporating myofibrillar proteins like myosin and Z-disc and sarcomeric proteins, and you're enhancing the contractile capacity and the force generation capacity of a muscle, then we would expect that reasonably to translate to more weight lifted over a broad time, right? So I think that's a reasonable proxy measurement. Now, it's really important if you use that one that technique is standardized.
Yes.
So I'm a stickler for that, and I encourage that to the nth degree. Like, if we're using this data to monitor your progress and predict it, it's super important you're performing every rep the same with excellent technique. And as that average, because we hold that constant, right? Theoretically, if that average weight changes, that's a good proxy measurement of progress. More from like a week to week standpoint, I typically design a week of training with between 4 and 6 sessions for hypertrophy, and that's the quote unquote micro cycle that we will accumulate the dose of up until a week that I observe a constellation of data that persuades me to give someone some more recovery. So we can call that like an overreach. Generally, that's 5 or 6 weeks worth of accumulation. So what do I look at to find that point out? This is kind of a different concept. So you may not want to hear about this. Just tell me to stop talking about it if you want. But just like within cycle monitoring, I also look at the average weight lifted and the volume from week to week. If I recommend or program for someone to add set volume or to add reps, and their volume load, their tonnage is the same as it was the previous week, with the instruction to actually increase it, that's probably a good sign that we need to back off a little bit, right?
Yep. Okay.
They weren't able to exceed their previous week's performance. So I quantify that. I actually use a software called AppLift. I'm a research and development officer for it, and we're working on building that out to make it even more robust.
Okay.
And make the monitoring and the analytics and graphing and all that easier to use and incorporate in your programming. But yeah, I can keep going on other things that I look at for training performance, but I think that's probably a decent starting point. I mean, do you have any questions about that or anything?
So I think one of the important, so volume, the fact you're tracking that week to week and within a mesocycle makes sense. And I think one thing just to for people to maybe practically to acknowledge, because I got some people really hung up on the numbers. When you rotate exercises in and out of your program, you can't compare one exercise's volume to another. For example, I had a guy who was going from squats and then he substituted leg presses, and then he wanted to, or no, the other way around, and he wanted to match his squat volume to his leg press volume, and he was just treating that as a simple sets times reps times load number, and obviously that meant he had to do about three times as many sets of squats to match that. So I think that's just a little practical thing that people, it's really sort of, almost blindingly obvious, but I know that people have made that mistake.
So Tom, there's a paper that I wrote with Brad Schoenfeld was the first author. It's called Calculating Set Volume for Muscles of the Limbs. I think it's the full title. That's a good sort of exploration of how do we quantify set volume, what factors should we consider. That's a good point, though. It's not as simple as tonnage. That's just one thing I look at with some assumptions.
Yes.
And I should say also that average weight change seems kind of hand-wavy and odd, but if, for example, from week to week, the only thing that changes is doing more sets in terms of the program or more reps, maybe a couple more reps for a fixed set volume, and the weight goes down precipitously, that's, I think, a good proxy of something's going on that we'd want to have a conversation about, right?
Sure.
So there's some other variables to consider. I'm not just saying linearly track average weight lifted and that's going to tell you the whole story, but yeah.
It's a piece of the puzzle, yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, I'd love to keep chatting about it. No, we sort of taking up too much of your time here. I suppose from my point of view, I want to give you a moment in a second to tell everyone where they can find out a bit more about you. And then the last thing, if you have time, we'll quickly discuss this. But getting back to this hard gainer thing, that I suppose this is, again, we've done all the detail stuff, but this is blindingly obvious to me, but hopefully they'll be helpful to people, is actually you're going to have to gain some weight if you want to pack on some muscle. Because this is one of the other things is I see guys, they're like, I don't know, 70 kilos. In fact, I was giving someone this spiel on an audio message on WhatsApp, an online client. But like, if you're 70 kilos and 5'10" now, no amount of recomposition and trying to like gaintain, which is the phrase I quite like, I've heard people use for this, of trying to drop fat and build muscle at the same time, is going to end up with you being jacked at 70 kilos. You're going to end up having to be maybe 80 or 90 or whatever. So I think, again, this sounds silly, but a lot of hard gainers, they're so scared of losing their abs, they can never make any gains.
Yeah, well, oh man, I can say, let me just share a personal experience with that. I have been as large as 255 pounds. I'm only 5'9".
That's a fair chunk of weight to carry around on 5'9".
Yes.
Yeah,
and going from about 90 kilos to what is that, about 120, roughly.
Just under 115 probably,
115.
230. Almost exactly.
Yeah. So that was when I had the most muscle mass that I've ever had in my life. Getting that heavy. Now, I did put on some body fat, but that worked really well, for me gaining that much weight. Now, that was a pretty logical approach over about a year. Gaining, about the first time I did that was about 40 pounds over the course of a year. I did it a little too aggressively, and I've done multiple iterations of this since. Right now I'm sitting at about 195 at about 9% body fat. And I can say the most muscle building progress that I've personally had was when I was willing to gain some weight.
Yes.
And a substantial amount of it over the course of about a year. And I was willing to give up, the grainy vascular abs, which I've never really had, but I'm working on it. But I mean, that and that muscle seems to stick around if you are intelligent about how you sequence your phases and you don't do anything too drastic after that massing period. You don't cut too much too quickly. I think the juice is worth the squeeze a lot of times, man. Because I think it's a fair, you could say, heuristic that muscle is much more difficult to gain than fat is to lose, and so it's pretty easy to lose 10% of your body mass in fat over the course of a few months. And I think cycling, for someone interested in maximizing growth over a broad time, I think there's a reason that the best bodybuilders, or among the best bodybuilders, right, they'll go through phases of massing and cutting and massing and cutting and repeating, right, over broad time. So that's wise advice from you, man.
I completely agree. It's nice to know that you have that practical example, though. I can completely agree with that cyclical approach being the most effective. And then it's a case of just delaying instant gratification. You can't have your abs all the time, but the way like the harsh way I try and tell guys is they're skinny. Well, you can be skinny with abs indefinitely and always never packs on the size, and that's the way forever. Or you can temporarily say goodbye to your abs so that you can eventually be jacked and ripped, and then that's where they want to go. And so can you delay instant gratification of always seeing your six pack to be able to get there? So I think a real key practical take home from you, and I'm impressed with 255 on 5'9", man. I feel like I just never tried hard enough. I'm going to have to push my body weight up.
Well, I got unnecessarily fat, so I'm not advising anyone to do that, but that happened, man.
Well, as a quick anecdote though, I think, like, again, from my best one, I didn't get quite that big, but mine was like 106 kilos, which is 235 pounds, I think. Anyway, I'm a little taller than you, but the same thing. But some fat had to come a long way. But it seems everyone I've spoken to who's packed on a reasonable amount of size has at one period done that thing where they've just gone, you know what, I'm all in on this. I'll accept the fat, and maybe I'll get too fat, but then you can very quickly, as you say, strip that fat off, and it's like I feel like that's it's a rite of passage, but almost it's actually necessary perhaps to maximize your results, to have a period of time a bit like that.
Well, and I think that there are ways to, as I've done different iterations of this now for the last decade, um, there are ways to minimize the damage. As I've learned, I don't want to say damage, minimize the amount of fat that you gain, right? And
Yes.
interestingly enough, I'm working with some researchers that just published a review article on body recomposition.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Chris Barakat is the
Yes.
name of the.
Also been on the show. Yeah.
Okay, cool, man. Yeah, so shout out to him. They did a really cool review article looking at body recomposition in trained individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been really interesting, digging into some of the literature and then with my own clients, exploring ways that we could potentially do that. Now, that kind of defeats what we were just talking about in terms of maximizing, but I do think that there are strategies you can use to minimize fat gain during a bulk.
Mm-hmm.
That maybe we can talk about some of those on another call, but
Sure.
it doesn't. I don't want anyone to get the impression that I'm saying like you have to get to 25 or 30% body fat to maximize your muscle growth. I think that there are some alternative strategies that you can
Absolutely.
use, and if you're willing to be more patient.
Yeah, completely agree. I think one of the things is that, well, we've made the mistake for them so that if they come to us for advice, they don't have to make that mistake. But it kind of feels like I'm so old now that I had to do these things before, or people like you were putting the research out there. But if you have to go through it yourself, almost that experience, you learn from it. Okay, so next time out, I know that rate of gain I was going was a bit aggressive. If I bring it down, is the ratio of fat to muscle better, and it saves me time on the other end for how long I have to diet, etc., etc. So now the great thing for people is there's so much information out there. I mean, that's a problem and it's a blessing and a curse, I suppose, because there's some misinformation. But if you look in the right places, there's some fantastic resources out there for people to really optimize the process.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would love. We're taking loads of your time up here. I'd love to get you on another time to chat about some of these other topics we've discussed here, but don't want to keep you too much longer. So I've got a quick fire round for you, just a few either or questions, and then we'll take a moment for you to tell people where they can know a little bit more about your stuff and find you online, etc. So, Cody, if you had the choice, would it be pizza or burger?
I'm dieting right now, man. That sounds really good.
All of them, both of them.
I think I'm gonna go with the cheeseburger, man.
Okay, good. Yeah,
Some fries. If fries come with the cheeseburger and fries, I would have to really ponder that though, and it depends on the type of pizza, right?
I'm glad that we've made it a tough question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough one, man. And not all pizzas and not all burgers are created equal.
No,
So
this is
it's
very
kind of
true.
boxing me in on that one. But yeah,
You don't want to commit. But right now, both sound pretty good.
Yeah.
You can by some of the questions the next question you're going to see. I'm fairly food focused with this. So is it chocolate or peanut butter?
wow, I'm hungry now.
I've ruined your diet for you. There's a binging coming.
Yeah. I'm gonna go with peanut butter on that one, man.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, next question is: if you could have a beach holiday or a city break, what's your choice?
Oh, definitely beach.
Mm-hmm.
I love the beach.
Now we stepped away from food for a second, but we'll bring it straight back there. So steak, rare or well done?
I'm a medium well kind of guy. I don't like
Okay.
rare or well done. I'm usually medium if I
Somewhere.
cook it. Now I'm kind of nerdy with my grilling.
Mm-hmm.
I use a thermometer and really try to fine tune the temperature and get it right and nice and juicy and that usually is medium is kind of where
Medium
I
issue.
fall.
Of course, to some extent it depends on the cut, etc. But
Very good point. Yeah.
we can't have too much nuance in my either or questions. So eggs, scrambled or poached?
Scrambled. Yeah, every time.
Okay. So some certainty on that one. That was an easy one. Right. Final question for me. Tell me something about you that we probably don't already know. This is the one that stumps most people and have to get the brain thinking.
Man,
Now, and we know you're a nerd for your steaks now, so you can't go there.
Oh gosh. Well, I'm kind of an open book, man. I don't know. I spend a lot of time reading in my basement. Um, Maybe a fun fact. I got married when I was 21, and my wife and I only dated 3 months.
Oh wow, yeah.
And then we were engaged for 3 months, and then we were married. So it was a pretty fast process. I knew that she was the one that I wanted to be with, though, man. So I think it worked out really well. We've been married for almost 10 years now. So
Fantastic. All right. Well, so you got the eyes on the prize, got the deal done, and then
yeah,
you're still hanging on in there now.
yeah. While she was willing to stay with me and say yes, I was like, let's get this train on the road. Yeah,
Yeah, with you reading research in your basement.
yeah, yeah,
That's the secret to a happy marriage.
yeah.
Okay, so actually I lied. It's not the last question. Who should I interview next? If I could access to anyone, who's your top tip?
Well, my mentor, Dr. Michael Roberts, would be awesome to have on.
Mm-hmm.
You had some questions on genetics. He would be a tremendous interview pertaining to that topic. He teaches a class all about that at Auburn.
Okay.
Great guy, brilliant. He could answer those questions a lot better than me. And he's really on top of that literature and actively digging into that. You know, someone else, man, that I haven't heard on many podcasts that has done some really cool research is Dr. Keith Barr.
Okay.
He's done some amazing research, and I haven't heard him on many podcasts, man. I think maybe one or two, and I'm a big fan of his work. Some of the people I threw out during the podcast you had already interviewed, the guys at Stronger by Science, so Greg and Eric.
Yeah, we've had Greg on. Yeah. Some good guys.
You had Andy on. I mean, he's doing some really cool work. But I think, Dr. Mike Roberts or Dr. Keith Barr would be really cool.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'll try and get them slotted in, booked in for an interview. That'd be fantastic. Might have to get a little introduction from you for Michael.
Okay.
And get that organised. Right. Cody, thank you so much. It's been fascinating. Really enjoyed that. Now, please take a moment. Let everyone know where they can find out more about what you're doing, what's going on in your world.
Yeah. Well, I'm on social media, so I'm on Instagram. That's at Dr. Cody Haun, so DrCodyHaun. I'm also on Twitter, the same handle. My website is drcodyhaun.com, so it's drcodyhaun.com. And then I actually just finished up the website for the in-person research and training practice.
Mm-hmm.
And that's lab.fitness.
Okay.
Is the domain for that.
That's live now, is it?
Yeah, it still has quite a bit of work left to be done on it, but yeah, it kind of gives an overview of the services that I'm providing, and I'll be adding to it and sharing information and ideally case reports and things on there, and keep people updated on the research that I'm into.
Excellent. All right. Well, we'll make sure all of those things are linked in the show notes. So, guys, go check it out. Loads of fantastic information available at those places. So get stuck in. All right. On that, that all that's left for me to say, Cody, is thank you very much for your time today. It's been brilliant, and have a great day.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
That wraps up today's episode. Thank you so much for investing your time with us. We really appreciate it. If you enjoyed what you heard and took value from it, please do me a favour by heading to iTunes right now, subscribing to the show, and leaving a review. Positive reviews, like 5 stars, hint hint, really help the ranking of the show and will help us to spread the word and keep getting top-class guests on. Make sure to follow Breaking Muscle on social media and me at Tom McCormick, that's TomMaccormick on Instagram. Bye for now, and I'm looking forward to catching you on the next episode of the Breaking Muscle podcast.